So with that, I'd like to now introduce our next speaker. It is indeed a great honor for Committee of 100 to welcome Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski. Dr. Brzezinski is a counselor and trustee of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and from 1977 to 1981, he was the National Security Advisor in the Carter administration. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his role in the normalization of United States and China relations, and for his contributions to the human rights and national security policy of the United States. He has been the recipient for numerous awards and decorations throughout his career, and his most recent book is Strategic Vision, America and the Crisis of Global Power. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all give a warm welcome to Dr. Brzezinski.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to participate in this discussion of a relationship which is not only critically important, but which in some respects has the potential of being historically unique. I have been told that I have roughly 10 minutes in which to share some thoughts regarding this subject, and then, if you wish, we can have an exchange of views. I think this relationship is historically unique because till now, international affairs, once they became global in scope, have involved, in every instance, of rivalry between major powers, a head-on conflict between them. In effect, much of modern history of the world has been dominated by a struggle for global hegemony. And the last century was particularly nasty in that respect. 2 world wars, the challenge of Hitlerism, the challenge of Stalinism, the Cold War. All of that has established a certain pattern of conduct which makes responsible scholars argue, and they have so argued, that the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China is bound, almost historically, inevitably, to be hostile, and that some collision between the two is unavoidable. And I suppose one could even argue that there are some tendencies currently at work which are beginning to send signals that this kind of historical regularity may repeat itself again. Even though the relationship started off initially in a very limited way, that is to say, the ice was broken and the relationship was established at the time of President Nixon and Mao Zedong, even though it was then consummated at the time of Deng Xiaoping and President Carter, and became, in effect, a crypto-alliance against the Soviet Union, even though in recent times US presidents and Chinese leaders have met, and at the last meeting between President Obama and Hu Jintao, a very important communique was signed outlining the pattern of partnership between the two societies. In the course of the last year, tensions have surfaced, and that has to be admitted, has to be faced. The Chinese have become concerned about what they may view as American meddling in the affairs, particularly of Southeast Asia, and particularly in regard to the China Sea. The United States has become concerned about some possible conflicts between China and the adjoining states, and also, perhaps, including even Japan. And the President of the United States gave a major speech last year, with which I'm sure you're all familiar, saying that the United States is returning to the Far East, is pivoting to the Far East, and in fact used some wording which seemed to imply that this is largely a military reassessment. That, I think, understandably, in turn, made some Chinese conclude, and have written publicly about it in China, that the United States is seeking, in some ways, to encircle China and to deny China its rightful place in the world. In brief, polemics between our two countries have surfaced. And that is a fact of life. And polemics, as you all know, can lead to more than just words. They can precipitate actions. There could be incidents in South China Sea. There could be some collision, hopefully accidental and not intentional, between the PRC and Japanese forces in the contested islands. And the United States, of course, could face the prospect of making some very difficult choices, and it certainly desires not to be involved in any widening conflicts in the Far East. Having said all of this, at the same time, I think it is important to remind ourselves that over the last several years, a pattern of genuine consultations and serious discussions regarding international affairs has developed between America and China. And though there are some occasional differences regarding geopolitical issues, and even more so regarding commercial issues, and potentially even more so regarding mutual cyber accusations, a pattern of responsible discussion and responsible consultation has developed. And that is a positive and an important accomplishment. Moreover, insofar as the United States itself is concerned, the United States sees its role in the Far East not as some intrusion, but essentially as a logical outcome of a situation that developed more than 100 years ago, when the United States became, in effect, a Pacific power present in the Far East through a relationship with Japan. Remember the Portsmouth Peace Treaty between Japan and Tsarist Russia, which was very much developed and encouraged by the United States. The United States, in terms of its own vision of the world, sees itself simultaneously as a power that projects itself outward through the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And hence, its relationship with countries across the oceans tends to be intimate because of that connection. And the United States does see itself involved in trying to maintain stability on the other side of the oceans. China, at the same time, is in a rather different geopolitical position. 2/3 of its borders are not on the sea, but are on land with adjoining countries. And some of these countries have had a history of less than close relations with China. Some of them are fearful of China. Some of them see themselves as rivals of China. And China, without doubt, is the preeminent power in that part of the world. It is the preeminent ancient empire of enormously impressive traditions and of great influence. And as it rises today in the world, it is only natural that it sees the areas near it as its own strategic peripheries. Some of you may be following Chinese press, and it is rather interesting to note, and I do so myself, that the Chinese military press increasingly talks explicitly about China's peripheral zones of interest and influence and relationship. All of that creates a rather complicated relationship between the United States and China, but one which is not guided by any overt ideological hostility of the kind that, for example, prevailed between the United States and the Soviet Union. It is not guided by any explicit competitive claims to global preeminence. It is guided increasingly by a mutual realization that both countries need each other. And that is a very new development in the history of international politics. that an established power and a rising power increasingly acknowledge the fact, the unique fact, that each needs the other. We need the Chinese in terms of the global economy. We need the Chinese in terms of global stability and Chinese involvement in the maintenance of global stability. The Chinese need access to our markets, to our financial arrangements, and the Chinese have a stake in the United States playing a responsible, stabilizing role in the world. So in the final analysis, the complementarity of interests outweighs the pressures towards conflict. And that is evident in the way both countries are responding to some recent issues. I have little doubt that the exaggerated bluster and threatening tones and gestures that were emanating from North Korea recently came to a halt because of constructive Chinese influence. The Chinese have made some public statements on the subject of North Korea, which did not mention North Korea explicitly, but pointed out quite directly that no country in the region has a right to destabilize the region and to plunge it into conflicts. Clearly, this was aimed at the North Koreans. And I personally suspect, and I emphasize I do not know, but I personally suspect that there probably was also a more explicit and pointed message from Beijing to Pyongyang, warning Pyongyang that the provocations and the threats from North Korea and the military gestures were adversely affecting China's overall interest in the stability and peace of the Far East. And I suspect that it was conveyed in a manner that drew the attention of the North Korean leaders and forced them to reconsider what was a very threatening posture. The United States has also taken the public position that on the Chinese-Japanese conflicts, it is essential that both parties avoid any direct confrontation. And to the extent that we can, we are trying to advise and to encourage a policy of mutual restraint, even though one acknowledges the fact that there are conflicting claims, historical and legal, involved in these islands, but claims which in this day and age can be resolved over time, either by mutual accommodation or by some assisted mediation. In brief, the American role in the Far East is not one of interference, but it is an attempt to contribute to regional stability. In that sense, it is a role that is also of interest and benefit to China. Accordingly, it is only natural that in such a context, our two leaders should interact as often as possible. And it is my own personal judgment that regular meetings between our top leaders are a necessity, that these meetings ought to be as informal as possible and as profoundly searching in terms of issues as is attainable. Because only through such consultations can we build a relationship of mutual confidence and trust. I read with enormous interest prior to this meeting, I reread with great interest, the communique that was issued here when Hu Jintao visited in January 2011. And if any of you are familiar with that communique, you will see that it is a remarkable roadmap to closer collaboration. That it is important that it be amplified, enlarged, and executed. I also noted that in recent days, President Xi met a number of Americans who, in terms of their status and rank, would have no entitlement to a meeting with the top leader of a superpower, which China is in terms of economic standing in the world. But according to protocol, would have no reason to meet with the head of state. For example, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of American Armed Forces had a private meeting with the president of China. The president of China met just the other day in a private meeting with 3 American governors. And I think this is also a sign of Chinese interest in maintaining a dialogue with the United States that addresses the key issues. So I started my introductory remarks to you before we turn to discussion by reminding you of the historical regularity of conflicts between major powers when one is dominant and another one is rising. I am also reminding you now that my argument has been designed to advance the proposition that that pattern may be broken, that we and the Chinese and us, I think, are intelligent enough to be aware of the fact that in the interdependent world in which we now live, a collision between such major powers would not produce a success for either one of them, but a calamity for both and for the international setting. And that gives me considerable optimism that we'll manage this relationship in a manner in which we'll become increasingly the decisive global partners in terms of our present historical era. So let me stop here, and if there's any inclination to raise some issues, I'm here for the next few minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Brzezinski. We have some questions for you. In fact, one has been submitted by a friend, a colleague of yours, Professor Shending Li in Shanghai. And the professor, it's 2 o'clock in China right now. I think that the professor must be very committed to the topic. To address this question to you, Dr. Brzezinski, how can China and the U.S. effectively collaborate to stabilize the Asia-Pacific in terms of territorial disputes, maritime and cybersecurity issues?
Well, these issues that are important in the area, plus the last one, which is a global issue, have not arisen just overnight and are not going to be resolved in the course of a single day. They have historical roots. I think what is important to recognize, however, that in dealing with these issues, the process has to be different from what it has traditionally been in world affairs. That is to say, try to resolve these issues by some formula in which there is a recognition of reciprocal interests in the outcome, rather than the use of force, which inevitably has an escalating effect, a dynamic effect, and at some point sometimes slips out of control. Moreover, the fact of the matter is that when it comes to some specific territorial issues involving China and its near neighbors, China is so much stronger that it is, in a sense, more of a Chinese responsibility to exercise restraint because the other parties are so much weaker. I think in setting an example of this kind, and China has done so traditionally over history, one sets in motion a pattern of relationships which become more enduring and more stable. The cyber issue is an extremely sensitive one, and it has dimensions which at this stage are ominous. Let's face that. It is not only a question of breaking into assets owned by others and unilaterally benefiting from penetrating such assets, or in fact, to be perfectly blunt, stealing them. It involves also the possibility of significant industrial sabotage, disruption, and even sudden infliction of paralysis on the other party, in the sense of making a modern, industrial, highly integrated society all of a sudden come to a standstill. People dealing with security affairs are concerned about the vulnerability of some countries to that condition. I have recently written an article in Financial Times in which I described this potential risk as involving anonymous wars. That is to say, a modern society could wake up in the morning and find that everything in it has come to a standstill. Nothing works, literally, nothing. All sources of power, water flows, communications, interactivity is paralyzed, and one doesn't know from whom and by whom. That could happen in a number of circumstances, and it happened partially to one country which was the first object of such an exercise from outside. I have in mind Estonia in the year 2007, when all of a sudden, for 3 days, The entire government was paralyzed. Telephones didn't work. Communications didn't work. All banks stopped operating, and so forth. That could happen these days to much larger and much more important countries, and I'm deliberately refraining from making names because I don't want to polemicize this issue, but I want to address it as a danger. And I think it is the kind of thing that, among others, we and the Chinese need to discuss it together, because certainly we have certain capabilities in that regard. I have no doubt that China has certain capabilities in that regard as well, and it is therefore very important for all of us to establish some rules of the game regarding cyber interference or cyber attacks, lest they get out of control. We did that a little bit in the course of the Cold War regarding atomic weapons. At first, the United States was the only one that had them. Then the Soviet Union started having them. We deliberately decided not to attack the Soviet Union at that stage in order to prevent them from having it. Rather, we waited. We let the Soviets build up roughly to our levels. We had moments of acute tension, such as in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But in the end, we both decided to de-escalate. I think some of the same technique may be used in terms of cyber. That is to say, one will acquire the capability to respond accordingly when the object of a cyber attack, but not produce an all-out conflict, but rather than lead to discussions that produce international conventions that bindingly control this kind of international activity.
On behalf of Professor Shanding Li of Fudan University, I thank you for the response. And we have a member of the audience has submitted a question about when comparing the cultures of political elites in the U.S. and China, what are their strongest leadership traits and what are their vulnerabilities?
Well, I would think in the case of the Chinese, the strongest is the sense of national pride and heritage, an awareness of the extraordinarily distinctive and impressive Chinese culture, which gives this enormous country of so many people a sense of very unique cohesion. And the risk in it is that the sense of nationalism is so strong that in crisis situations it could become very inflamed and potentially even exercise excessive influence on how an otherwise very rational and calculating government finds itself able to conduct its affairs. Nationalism is a very emotional force. By way of example, I'll cite you one incident in recent times. The collision between China and the Japanese over some islands occurred at a time when there were soccer matches, football matches between Japan and China on Chinese territory. And the crowds, not inspired by the government, not manipulated by the government, but out of nationalist anger, violently disrupted these football matches. And one can imagine that escalating to a far larger degree in the event of some serious collision. I think that is the liability. In terms of America, I think what gives America its sort of cultural, political impetus is not long history, obviously, because we don't have it, but its sense of identification of America with the future, whereas in China the identification is with a glorious past. An identification of America with a future in which we, as a people, have the confidence that fundamentally our democratic system, in spite of its many shortcomings, is the way most of humanity will want to govern itself in the future, as more and more of humanity becomes better educated, more aware of its general conditions, more ambitious in dealing with public decisions. That gives American society great confidence about itself and pride in itself. The weakness of American society, I think, pertains to the lack of really careful and deep-seated understanding of international problems by the American public. which by and large is very poorly informed about international affairs, and as a consequence has a tendency to be susceptible to demagogy when serious crises develop. I have in mind, for example, after 9/11, the tendency to identify all Muslims as terrorists, to use such words as terroristic jihad, which is the use of word terrorism in connection with a religious term, a holy war. Things of this sort tend to push the American public into reactions which are not quite as calculated and as rational and as restrained as one would wish, and may even depart somewhat from democratic norms.
How about another rousing applause for our keynote speaker, Dr. Brzezinski. Thank you so much. Thank you.